Well, here, what a year. What a year it was. And I'll tell you that it was absolutely it was not a great year for movies. It was actually a terrible year for movies. Yeah, I didn't see too many, but what I have seen, they're mostly bad average. Mostly bad and average. They're bad enough to be bad, some of them pretty bad, or others being that terrible or worse. Some that I even forgot about, and there's only a couple movies that I end up liking this year. Not counting Mario, because that was on last year's list. But yeah, other than that, there was a few movies that I liked. Even with a wild year like this, with not too much to remember from the entire year in general. But even with that I think I might have enough movies to make a best and worst. Even with a bad year like this, I still got enough movies to make a best and worst list for this year. But now that this terrible year is over, which films ended up being the worst? Which ones that are the worst of this year were absolutely the worst of this year? And which ones were the absolute highlights of this year? This is me, and this is the best and worst list of 2023. Number 5, worst. Ruby Gillman, Teenage Kraken. Well, this is not obvious surprise to everyone that one of these movies had to fall here, especially a movie that nobody even knows about. Well, it's a movie that nobody even cares about. It only got like a 2-week release, only been in theaters for 2 weeks, and that's actually one of the movies that I actually had to watch at home, unlike the other movies that I found on streaming. I could watch on streaming older movies, but this one was the only newer movie that I had to watch at the comfort, at home. And what it is, it's pretty that bad. Honestly, yeah, it's pretty bad, but it was mostly forgettable, and there wouldn't be enough for me to remember from the movie itself. Sure, I'll give it some credit. Well, the movie is not that awful, thanks to some characters that will be worth remembering, good voice acting, but there isn't enough to save the movie from being that terrible. It's not enough to save the movie from being that bad. But where the movie can break down into some, movie still has its issues. Sure, the Kraken is beautiful to watch, but it's still got some issues, like a few obnoxious characters, the mom not being honest, and too many flashing lights. Yeah, this may be it's not the worst, it's not one of the worst movies I have seen this year, but it was kind of mostly forgettable, where I don't remember even what even went. I probably forgot most of the movie by then. It's mostly that bad. Terribly that bad. And if Ruby Gillman could do something, a movie being honestly that bad, it may not be the worst of this year, but it's still unforgettably forgettable. I think some forgettable people, but the reason why this movie is kicking off the worst list, where yeah, it may be mostly forgettable and a bad movie, but I think if there maybe a few other people would enjoy this if they can get through the movie entirely. Not a terrible movie though. Number 4, worse. Monster High, 13 Wishes. So there is some wishes. Okay, let's go through the bad news. The bad news is, okay, good news and bad news. The bad news is this movie's on the worst list. Bad news is the movie is on the worst list, and yes, it was another terrible movie. But there's still the good news. The good news is that it's not at number 3 worst. Good news is it's not at number 3 worst. But how did something like Monster High still got on the worst list, but actually so close got out of close to being bad? Yeah, it was pretty bad, but honestly, I'll give it some credit for at least trying to put some effort into it. Like, at least the characters are pretty likable. Characters are a bit likable, and the voice acting is actually pretty that good. But what doesn't work pretty good, but doesn't work that sometimes doesn't work, the movie can definitely leave into some issues. Some issues like weak story points, and Wiz has a bit of a two-side to the character. Sometimes she can be pretty likable, and sometimes she can be pretty annoying. Sometimes she can kind of just be irritating and just cause a few issues. But the movie also has some bit of a hypnotizing tone, which doesn't really, which makes things a little too spooky, a little too scary, and a little hard to get through the rest of the movie. Here, I actually had to rewind most of it. I actually had to rewatch some of it because I mostly forget about it, most about it. But the reason why it may be on the worst list, but the reason why it's not anywhere lower than here is because the movie put some effort in it. There was some effort put in it. But honestly, I'm pretty sure that this is more for the Monster High fans. I think fans of Monster High are pretty much going to have a better time watching this movie. Going to have a much better time sitting through this movie, watching this movie. So honestly, yeah, it may be pretty bad, but it may not be one of the worst movies of this year, but this movie may not be one of the worst of this year, but honestly, it's not for me. Number 3, worst. Baby Shark, this big movie, I think it's how it's pronounced, and Wish. So, this is honestly the point where we start getting to some movies that really start to fall apart here. And honestly, I'm going to tell you why these two fell here. Baby Shark, first off, the Baby Shark movie, it has some effort put into it, at least with some good visual. It's at least a good point. Honestly, it could have been much better than, maybe it's the same as Good Burger 2. Honestly, not bad, harmless enough that people can actually, harmless enough. Honestly, yeah, some voice acting, honestly, with some guest stars, with some good voice acting and some good music, but that isn't enough to save this movie from being at the number 1, save this movie from being terrible, thanks to some some weak story and a hypnotizing villain that gets pretty obnoxious. Oh yeah, and here's the hypnotizing tone comes back again from this movie again. Honestly, this is the only other movie that's going to have this type of theme here. Wish, on the other hand, yeah, this could have been a good Disney movie. Honestly, it could have been a good movie in general. But at least with that, this movie could have been I could have been much nicer to the movie. Could have been much nicer to the movie if I would have been much nicer to it if, well, it would have been much nicer to this one, and Elio would take its place. But unfortunately, since Elio won't be on this list, its Wish is the one that has to fall here. I'll give it at least some credit that there is at least some effort put in here, like there is some good voice acting and a great soundtrack, but what keeps this movie away from being harmless is the obnoxious villain that has to ruin everything. Obnoxious villain that ruins everything gets too much screen time and obnoxiously annoying to the point it's going to be obnoxiously annoying. I wouldn't even be able to bear through this movie if this guy was even in it. Honestly, this may be some of the worst at this year, and they may be some pretty bad, but this is where their cracks start to show. This is where they're weak. In problems, general. That's what I meant in the cracks start to show. I meant in problems, though. Number 2, worse. Turbo. Alright, I think I made a pretty huge mistake of watching this. Honestly, yeah, I thought this was going to be pretty good of a harmless movie. But no, this movie actually had to be that bad. And unlike the other movies from the worst list, this one has no redeeming qualities. Of course, this has no redeeming qualities. This movie is just even bare to sit through. There's nothing worth remembering from this movie in general. I actually don't remember anything that happened in this movie because probably most of them has been erased from my brain because how terrible this movie is in general. But that has to make it this worse and this far down on the list is because the movie is really that slow. This movie takes forever to finish. And there's not even one thing to like about it because it's that slow. And nothing to like about it. I so don't want to put this on the worst list, but I tried to find something to enjoy about this movie, but everything is just useless. There's nothing to even enjoy about this movie except being pretty bad. Pretty bad and slow at the same time. There's only one thing that the snail is fast enough to do is not get at the number 1 worst spot. Because number 1 is safe for something even worse than a snail that went that slow and wasted an hour and a half of my time. And the number 1 worst movie of 2023 is Barbie. Okay, I am so sorry to say that. I'm so sorry to do this. But yeah, it's really the worst of this year. Especially something that pretty terrible enough to be the worst of this year in general. Even with that, this movie is that terrible. Terrible. Number 1, it's just the writing is just terrible. The movie story is terrible, with not even something to like in the story. Actually, I kind of think this is a ripoff to Ugly Dolls, especially how it's basically the same story, but not enjoyable. But to make it worse, this movie also had to add another annoying antagonist just to be obnoxiously annoying and ruin everything. Again, ruin everything and being obnoxiously annoying at the same time. But it also has some obnoxiously annoying at the same time. The characters are not even worth mentioning. The characters are not even worth remembering. And this movie is basically trying to get and this movie shouldn't have made the ones who hate Barbie, the ones who don't like Barbie, probably to not to see it. But no, they wanted this movie to be for everyone, even if you don't like Barbie. But to top it all off, the songs are not even worth being enjoyable. Sure, I let the songs slide for the rest of the movie since they were even enjoyable, but this one is actually obnoxiously annoying. Also, Ken will probably not trying to stop singing either. And even if Ken even tries, he just makes things terribly bad. Actually, he just makes things actually pretty worse anyway. This is why, even with all those reasons, and all these reasons why this is actually the worst, and all those annoying things topped on top of it, this is why Barbie ends up being the worst of 2023. Oh man, that was so frustrating to get out of my system. Yeah, I had to get all that anger out. Anywho, yeah, I'm glad I got all that anger out of those bad movies. Okay, now that we got rid of the bad movies, before we go and take a look at the good movies that 2023 could offer, let's take a look at the honorable mentions that are much better which are much better movies. Okay, so now we're going to move on to films that, well, there are still, even though this year had some way worse stuff, and some of the worst that this year can offer, but there are still a good few amount of them that were good. There are still a couple of films that are in the middle. They're not some of the worst, and definitely not they're not some of the worst, but could have done a little bit better. A little bit better. These may not be on the worst or the best list, but they are still pretty decent and okay on their own. Okay films on their own. They may not be some of the worst, but they may not be some of the best, but at least they're not some of the worst, but at least they're a little bit better films. In no specific order, the honorable mentions of 2023 are Sonic the Hedgehog 2. Sonic the Hedgehog Movie 2. Sonic the Hedgehog Movie 2 doesn't have the best story. Doesn't have a very steady story, but the voice acting is still good, and some of the action scenes are still enjoyable to watch, so it's not a bad film. Action scenes are fun to watch, so it's not bad of a film. And scenes are fun to watch, but it's not all bad of a film. Nick All-Star Brawl 2. Nick All-Star Brawl 2. Sure, Clockwork ruined the story mode by being... Sure, the story mode is not the best since the characters are still lovable. The rest of the characters are still lovable, and there was still a lot of effort put into this one. A lot of effort was put into this one. Robin Hood. Sure, the story has a few weak points, but it still had a few weak points, but it still had a good time with it. Migration. Sure, one of the more weaker movies on this list. But the Minion short was still hilarious, and I have no intentions of putting this one on the worst list. Let's get out of the worst list by a hair. Got it out of the worst list by a hair. Trolls Band Together. Sure, some of the newer characters have some annoying traits, but at least the soundtrack, at least there were still a few new characters to like, and the soundtrack is still pretty catchy. So at least one of the better DreamWorks movies this year. Shrek 2. It was a good movie. Honestly, it was a really good movie, but the only problem with the movie can consist that King Harold did get annoying pretty quickly, and the movie can leave into some weak points. Papa's Polaria to Go may not be one of the best Papa Louie games, despite having some huge problems and huge flaws. The game is still highly creative, and those popsicles are designedly colorful. The Wild Thornberrys movie, not a terrible. Sure, the story could use some work, but it wasn't a terrible movie. But at least I came from what I. It wasn't a terrible movie, but at least I got what I came for. And finally, The Wild. I do like this movie, so it deserves a mention. If I had to extend both the best and the worst list to fit all of these honorable mentions, where would they go? Where would they be? Well, in this case, if that was the case, the ones in the worst would include Nick All-Star Brawl 2, Migration, Trolls Band Together, and the Wild Thornberrys movie. The ones in the best would include Papa's Polaria to Go, The Wild, Robin Hood, and Shrek 2, while Sonic the Hedgehog 2 falls in the middle as the honorable mention. Some of them gave it their best effort, while others could have done a little bit better. This is going to go down to all the movies that tried. Now, let's move on to the best list where we have some of the best movies of the year. Shall we? Number 5. Best. The Sonic the Hedgehog movie. Okay, so this was actually jumbling. Okay, so first off, it seems like Sonic made a bit of an improvement the last time we seen this hedgehog. Back in 2020, he was last time on the worst list, but how did he manage to get himself on the best list? Well, this originally was going to be on the honorable mentions list, but Sonic made at least a bit of a speeder impression to make this at least enjoyable. Yeah, well, Sonic the Hedgehog 2 needed some improvement. This one was actually the best out of the two. This one, I had more fun time with this one. Sure, there are some flaws, like the story can have a bit of issues. Story can run into some weak points and some issues. One of the characters are actually really annoying. And there are a few too many flashing lights, especially in some of the action scenes. Even with those issues, the movie still had we still had the best it could try. And it's still good at being decently good, just being a good movie. Thanks to some good voice acting, an outstanding and very chatty antagonist, some good voicing, some good heart story, and with having a good heart and some good action scenes. Well, it looks like Sonic has speed his way through a better impression. Even though he's starting off the best list, what's more than a better way to start the best list with a speeding hedgehog? Number 4, best, Shark Tale. A lot of people are going to be asking me, why did this movie end up being on the best list? Well, in honesty, it's not that bad of a movie. Honestly, yeah, it's not bad of a movie or anything. It was pretty good for a movie it is. Even a movie about talking fish, it was at least somehow enjoyable. Yeah, I do want to say that a movie like this, who is actually pretty well done on its own, still has a bit of its problems in the story. It has its problems, like the story can have some weak points, and some of the characters start talking off a little annoying, but I get used to them afterwards. Even with that, the movie still has a good story. The characters are at least somehow are pretty much evenly likable and not excessively annoying. Honestly, the characters from Barbie did much worse. Honestly, the characters from Barbie were more annoying in this movie. So, yeah, even if there was some annoyance in this movie, I say it probably took some time to get used to, or wasn't really noticed. Wasn't really noticed otherwise in any other case. Oh yeah, and even if Oscar does goof off, that does not get on my nerves, people. If Oscar does start to screw up, then that doesn't really bother me in any way. Oh yeah, and the reason why this movie, and the movie also had a nice moral. It's to not do what Oscar did. Honestly, yeah, this isn't an oppressive underwater movie, and I'll say, at least this is much better than Ruby Gillman. Number 3, best, Paw Patrol, the Mighty Movie. Something like that. Honestly, throughout this year, Paramount has not given us some really good movies. I mean, sure, some of their streaming, even their streaming movies are not great. Not even Monster High, which I actually decided not to mention on this list for any reason because that movie is actually bad enough. And the embarrassment of Baby Shark. And Baby Shark throwing in a hypnotizing tone at the last minute and changing the idea of having this to a Christmas story to a hypnotizing adventure story. As for the Turtles, also there was the Ninja Turtles, which honestly, despite being a big fan of them, it did not end up well. The only good thing Paramount did put out this year was the Paw Patrol Mighty Movie. Did the same thing like it did with Minions Rise of Gru by setting the expectations a little too high. But that doesn't mean that's a bad thing. Sometimes you just don't know how a movie will end up until I actually see it for myself. But even if I set my expectations a little too high, but the movie didn't meet my expectation. The movies did not meet my certain expectations, what I was expecting from this movie. But it doesn't mean that it was still a good movie. Honestly, it was still a good movie. Don't get me wrong. Still a good movie. Don't get me wrong. especially after all the garbage I had to deal with during 2023. Honestly, there are much worse movies I could be watching right now. Honestly, there's just much worse movies I could be watching right now besides this one. But this movie did end up with a couple of problems, with the story not being as strong as the first one. Story weak points, and some of the characters, including Ryder, were a little bit negative. As for the celebrities that were in this movie but only got at least like one scene or something, I didn't mind them. Even if they just got like that one scene, I guess that was fine. They were not too irritating. So that's something I'll let pass. But even with the issues, the movie still provided at least something enjoyable. The movie had a good story, and yes, the message. Oh yeah, and I almost forgot that the message of this movie wasn't as strong as the first one. Honestly, yeah, I think the first one was better than this one, but don't get me wrong, it's still a good movie. Even with that, if it's not even as good as the first one, I'm not going to say it's a bad movie. It still had some good things to say about it. Well, the story was still good. The characters were likable, including some nice voice acting. The villains were enjoyable, which I will talk about in just a moment. The villains were enjoyable, which I will talk about a bit of a comparison. The villains were enjoyable, which I'll be getting to in just a moment. The soundtrack is peppy and nice. It has some good action scenes, and a good amount of humor. Also, this movie, like I said before, had a great antagonist. It's actually one of the most enjoyable villains of this year, honestly. There was also that weird lady from that Ninja Turtles movie, but she was terrible. She was mean and gross, and kind of ruined the movie for me. Story fans try to take things seriously and not try to ruin the entire movie for me. Also, I just wanted to also add that she actually provided some of the jokes in the movie. Honestly, whenever the people call her a mad scientist and she gets mad, I can't help but giggle a little, because that's actually pretty funny. Even if this movie is not as strong as the first Paw Patrol movie, at least it was a good movie. And hey, a good movie is all I can ask for. Number 2, best zombies. Okay, so I just want to say for a second here, that I didn't think this movie was going to get this high on the list. Especially after the third one being an absolute disaster. Honestly, the third one just cranked the flashing lights up to the most maximum. They turned out the flashing lights to the biggest volume you could think of. Honestly, flashing lights hurt your eyes, people. Why can't you not see that? Okay, even with that, I'm getting a little off topic. But yeah, zombies, which I was quite impressed with. This is actually one of the 2 movies that actually I enjoyed, that actually they were like a bit of a hidden gem, which the other one I'm just going to get to in a moment. Yeah, even with zombies, it's even actually that impressive. Actually very impressive how the zombies were able to pull off an impressive movie. Oh no, not Bucky. All of the zombies, except for Bucky, because Bucky didn't do anything. All the zombies, except for Bucky, because all Bucky did was ruin the movie. So, no thanks to him. But besides him, all the zombies really pulled off a very impressive movie. I have never seen any movie franchise that was able to make the first movie in their whole franchise this good. Even with that impressive level, these zombies do come down with a few of their flaws, including the story had a very frightening opening scene, Allison's parents being a little annoying. annoying, weak points in the story, and of course, I cannot mention Bucky tried to ruin this movie by being a complete jerk like he always does. Honestly, this is why I really can't stand Bucky. All he does in these movies, he either tries to pick on at least one of Allison's friends. Can't this guy just improve for once? Probably no, because Bucky never learns. Even with those problem issues don't even stop this movie from being this high enjoyment. Strong message about standing up and treating people the way they should be treated. I think it was nice that Allison, despite Zed being a zombie, I think a zombie and it would probably eat your brain. Zed was actually a zombie. Allison was being pretty nice to him. She was even nice enough to not egg his house. How kind is that? Really, I think Allison was being very kind to Zed, even though she was a little scared of him at first, but it was still nice that she was being very kind to him. This may be one of the biggest and this may be one of the strongest Disney Channel movies I ever saw, but unfortunately, this movie isn't the best of this year because there's still one other movie that is actually really that good. Honestly, there's one other movie that tops this one off. Even if Zombies isn't the best of this year, it still stood up as a strong movie of its own. And I'm still quite impressed with it. And the number one best film of 2023 is Disney Dreamlight Valley and Elementals. And now we're probably going to get to the moment everybody has been waiting for, the best movie of 2023. And that movie actually goes to Elementals. Now, nobody expected this movie to be at number one best. Everybody was asking me to put one of the other best movies this year. They thinking the other best movie would be like Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse or something like Barbie, but no, Barbie's not here because Barbie's at the number one worst movie. Honestly. Who can even stand that garbage? As for Elementals, at first I thought this was going to be another Pixar movie that was another garbage original. But after taking some time to actually get to see what this movie is, it's actually really that good. Of course, the movie does have some bit of its issues, like it can have its weak points in the story, some unnecessary fighting, but even a little lie, even some lying, as for the lying and the unnecessary fighting between the two, those are actually excusable. Those were actually excusable because honestly, you can't stay mad at Emperor Wade forever. But the reason why this movie is actually at number one best is because of how calming it is. It's actually a very calm movie. It has some quick moments, but also it feels like that sometimes it has a right balance between the two, and sometimes it actually does have its quiet moments, where those quiet moments in the movie, like when the characters are like just sitting there not talking too much, it actually makes things very calming. And also the movie definitely played on the emotions because honestly, this movie is very emotional. Very emotional. Because I cried at this. Because I literally cry at this movie. Every time I watch it. I'm not saying that's a bad thing if I'm crying at a movie. There are a couple other movies that I put up here that made me cry, so this isn't the first one. And the fighting, I let that slide because this is a Pixar movie and we can't stay mad and we're gonna wait forever. And honestly, this is not only the first time we had a couple that had a fight or something. A movie that, wasn't good, but much better than a High School Musical movie where everybody has to go under a Sharpay's contract. Honestly, if we had to take Wall-E over, I think Wall-E's more harmless. than just sitting through another one of these terrible High School Musical movies. I'm so glad that franchise is over with. And for all those reasons, that is why Elementals is definitely deemed Elementals definitely the best of 2023. Honestly, despite being a terrible year for films. But honestly, I'm just hoping that next year for 2024, the movies are much better. Honestly, I'm just hoping for 2024 that I get to see some better movies, both in theaters and on streaming. So hopefully I hopefully get to see some better stuff in 2024.